I'm here to present a project in which I worked like a couple of years ago after the flood that took place in between Iowa and Nebraska. Uh, Before that, I started working. I come from a totally different country. What happened here was pretty much snow on the ground and then some rainfall on the snow, right? And we had a massive flood, never like haven't seen it before in years. The similar one that we saw before was in I think 2011. I come from Colombia, and when they told me like, "Oh, you have to work in something related to snow," I was like, "What is that? I haven't touched it before." But it was exciting. It is a nice project what I'm going to present here. I've been working for the last 5 years with the Iowa Flood Center, developing models and mostly involving all the hydrological issues regarding the flood system that we have implemented there. And what I'm going to show you today set like the future for what we want for our system, right? Like we took this as an opportunity to improve our methods, to adapt new ways of doing stuff, to improve the hydrological model, to have a better representation of the network. So I will cover that in the time. So starting again with the introduction, what we saw in 2019 was kind of unexpected. What you are seeing here is the snow water equivalent that we have accumulated in March 11. You can see the area that we are covering or where we are working is this region over here, even though we are showing like a larger domain. But after that day, we got in the following 2 days, not like super significant rainfall event, but it was somehow important. Even though this event detonated a large flood that that creates destroys some levees and flooded some places along its way down from the Missouri River. Here is an image of Fremont County in Iowa, one of the cities that got like most impacted, and the other one is in Hamburg, Iowa. I think this is downstream from the first one that I showed. And both of them, in the case of Hamburg, I know more about this because then we explored more and more in depth what happened here. Is we didn't only have the Missouri River coming, but also the Nizhny Vodna River, in where a really similar thing happened. But at the time, and they both took place, creating a devastating flood over the small town. So, but before going forward, and what I want to say, like when we were doing this study, then I just took the time to look at the records on Iowa. The points that you are looking here is all the USGS gauges that we have records at inside of Iowa. I'm sorry, there's no Nebraska side, but you can imagine the story will be quite similar. And the colors are representing the trend of increasing peak flow during this time of the year. So you can tell that during February to April, there has been a significant increase in terms of percentage, which means these early spring or late winter events are becoming more and more common, and seems like not only more common, seems like more stronger. And that also captured our attention because in this region, usually large floods, they don't take place in March. They are more common in May, April, or even though like more into the year, like June and July. Sorry for that. So that brought us our attention there. Okay, after the flood event that we had there, all this project was created thanks to the Iowa Economic Development Authority, along with BNIM. We started working on this project. It was like more on a resilience idea to create a information system for the region that covers all the area of the Missouri River in between Nebraska and Iowa. Not upstream of the river. I think I will show that later, because you say, Missouri River is a huge monster, I would say, like a huge watershed. And we weren't able to just go and tackle that. So the idea is to just cover this domain, getting information from the upstream release. What is this dam called? The Clark and I forgot, but yeah, maybe you know better the area than me. But there is a big dam upstream from Iowa and Nebraska that controls the Missouri River over there. So we took that information as an input. Okay, so this is a small summary of how the system was built. The idea behind was to have a web portal page where we show all the results on live, real-time flood forecasting system for all the tributaries and the Missouri River itself in the domain that I just mentioned. So to have this, we developed like a hydrological model that distributes the landscape into hill slopes and links. I will talk a little bit more about later. Along with that model, we also feed it with live information from USGS gauges. So this is kind of data assimilation into the model to have better representation of the discharge where we have observations. Along with that, we do an update of the geometry, updating where there was breaches on the levees. And also we did like couple all these system with a hydraulic model on live, which is one of the key aspects of this. Like now we are not just reporting discharge at the links produced by the hydrological model, but at the time this hydrological model is working along to report discharge on different segments of the Missouri River where a hydraulic model is online running and generating flood inundation maps. So that was like one of the key aspects of this project and innovations that we have, which is what I'm showing here. Like we have a 10-day water forecast that we take for the HRR model. Then we run it through Mr. Fees, which we will be presenting inundation maps, flood arrival times, and levee freeboard as information for stakeholders and the people that lives around the area. So now a little bit more of like where is the area that we're working at. As I mentioned earlier, Missouri River is a large river and also includes the Platte River, the Elkhorn, the James River, and here I think is the Big Sioux. But we limit ourselves to just this area. And what we are doing is taking information and data assimilation from this point here and this point over here, and also the Platte River and Elkhorn. So those are like our boundary conditions for our model, which is just the area inside what we call the hydrologic model domain. For the hydrological model, as I just mentioned, we use what we call the HLM, the Hislop Link model. So Hislop Link model pretty much what does is a decomposition of the landscape into the natural shapes of small hislopes, which are like the small drainage areas that drain into each channel segment. And then we have the links or the channels. And we represent the whole system as a collection of ordinary differential equations that we solve through a solver developed by the Iowa Flood Center to bring information at each channel segment. At this case, we set it up to report information every hour, but it can be done or set up to make it up to every minute. But for hydrological applications of what we're doing here, we consider that 1 hour is more than okay. But I will go into more details later. Okay, now more details that we developed for this project. So for this project, we developed, along with partners from the University of Nebraska, we developed like a snow water equivalent module in where we are simulating also how much snow water equivalent is getting stored into the hislopes and how much of it is getting melted due to rainfall and high temperatures at any given time. Along with that, we also try to incorporate the effect of the harvest and the water consumption by the crops. considering that Iowa, Nebraska are like largely developed in terms of agriculture, right? And the other modification that we did to our model is also including tide drainage uh, conceptualization. So this is also a work that we developed before this, but we saw this project as a good excuse to bring it in and see how it works. Because in the past we have seen the tiles, even they don't, at what we know, they don't create a big difference of peak flows, but they do create a large difference on base flow, recession, shapes, and the overall balance of the water that you have. Like, it's not changing because you have still the same amount of water, but kind of diminish or fast, it, it moves water away faster from the hill slopes than what you expect. So we include all these three different modifications into the model, trying to have a better representation. Another thing that I want to say here before we move forward is we try to have a really good representation of our hill slopes, which means we take digital elevation maps of relatively high, sorry, my words escape from my mind, high definition of 10 meters, which allows us to represent pretty well not only the hill slopes, but also the network, which means when then you go to the Google map or the map where we show our results and you put the network that we got in top of the Google network that probably most of you have seen when you go into Google, our network fits pretty well with what they are saying. And at the time also, we try to follow as much as we can the national, the NHD Plus network, or National Hydrologic Data Set, allowing us to, for example, assign names and assign like more features to our network. So along those configurations and the improvements that we did, I just want to mention one improvement over here that I'm showing in this point, which is using in red, you will see the results from HLM using the snow module, and in blue, you will see the model before using that or without the snow module compartment. This is the case of the Nizhny River, where we have like 5 USGS gauges, and in all of the cases, you can see that there is a large improvement after including the snow compartment or the snow formulation into the model. We also compare it with a formulation in where we don't simulate the snow processes, we just include them as additional forcing to the model, like just a snow melt going directly into the channels. Also, along with that, we did like a comparison of the snow water equivalent that we have stored over the hill slopes, which is what I'm showing here, against the observations. And we see that there is a good match in space and also in time, which means we can keep developing on this, working on this to have like a better representation and better forecast systems for this time of the year, which I mean this time of the year like March, early April, or late February. Now, the other part of the system is the hydraulic model. So for this, we use the information already done by the U.S. Army Corps for the 1D HEC-RAS model, covering all this area that you see on blue. A lot of this area was converted into a 2D flow areas to capture all the complex flows and also like to do a better representation of the floodplains whenever there was flooding. And finally, we include the different levee changes after the event, and also we did simulations including like projected changes according to the engineers. So all these results can be seen online. I just tried it. It's working still. And on what we call Mr. Fish, I call it Mr. Fish, but it's MR Fish by the Iowa Flood Center. So I think I will show you a couple of slides, and then probably we will try to show you how it works on live. So here's, if you Google it, this is the launching page that you will get. If you go to Launch Mr. Fish, it will show you something like this, where you can see the area of interest, also like the area where we are simulating the hydrological model. In green, you will see all the USGS gauges, and in blue, all the gauges installed by the Iowa Flood Center. So you can tell there are only gauges over Iowa, and there is a bunch, like 8 gauges that we installed over the Elkhorn River in a project that was happening at the time with the University of Nebraska and with the MATC, funded by MATC. So we already left the gauges there. They are still reporting. I think they are still working okay. And for those also, we created some curves to have information about the discharge along with the elevation. Now, in the platform, you can do zoom in, zoom out, click on any of the gauges. It will report the actual discharge. It will show the forecast for the model. Those are some like things that we already have on the Iowa Flood Center page for the Iowa. This is like an example of clicking on a gauge. So you will have like the current level, the projected level, and also like the different flood levels according to the National Water Service. Another like aspect that we are proud of that we include here is we include something that we call the flood inundation index, which is pretty much every time that the model is running on the forecast, we divide that forecast by what we know is like, we estimate like how much of that water could be like dangerous or could represent a hazard on every link or on every channel of the domain that we are simulating, which are these colors that go between blue and red. So whenever you see a light blue, is like low to almost nothing, or red, there is a high potential. And this can be seen here on the house with the flooded house going as flood extent mapping. That's the other item that we included, not only this flood index, but also we can present live what is the simulated flood map by the HEC model that you can access from flood extent mapping. Here is a zoom in to show like some of the results. There wasn't too much happening back there, and since then, almost nothing has happened since 2019. I'm sorry for that, but not sorry, like it's okay. This is what we want, but we haven't like had the opportunity to really test or see what is going to happen. But we are like sure that these will do some forecast on the situation. But also for people to see, we have like different historical events. So we have the flood of 2019, 2016, and 2011. And in most of them, we have different like, scenarios. Like what will happen if we transpose the rainfall? What happened with the new levee alignment, without levee breaches, etc. You can click on them and see a video animating how the flood extent develops depending on each one. So this is kind of the animation, but just going through the slides, I think you see a bit of how it works. And I think that's pretty much all. So the idea is just presenting this as a tool for all the people around the Missouri River in between Iowa and Nebraska, and also as an idea of how we think these information systems must go forward just to improve the decision making based on not only hydrologic but also hydraulic models. And something that I forget to mention is also including data they observe the data from discharge gauges. So I think that's all from me, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a microphone right here if anyone. Yeah.
Thank you. If I understand correctly, you integrated contribution to base flow or stream flow from drainage tile, correct?
Yep.
So did you make some assumptions that, I guess, how did you come to that? What kind of contribution, how much flow how much variable contributed by the drainage tile, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
Great question. Thank you. So for doing that, that was like one of the first works that I did when I arrived here. For that work, what we did is we took a totally physical base model, because all what I just described is more a conceptual model, what we call, because for a large domain, you can go and try to represent like every process at a high detail. You know what I mean? Like you can just go and try to represent in detail how water is going into the tiles, things like that. So what we did is we took a small physical base model. In this case, it was Hydros 3D. There we put like different scenarios with tile and without tiles on a small key slope, and we grab all the information from there, and there from that point we represent that functional form of the tiles into our model. So that was the first part of your question, like how do we do that? That was like the first technical aspect of it. Then we validated for the whole state of Iowa. What we saw is a significant change in the total volume modeled by our model. Like we improved our bias. We went from having bias of like minus 20% to almost like minus 5 or minus 2%. So to answer your question, it's about like 20% of difference. Usually it is not reflected on the peak flow. You see it more reflected on the recession flow. So when the peak flow is just going down again, tiled systems, they have a faster recession curve compared to non-tiled systems. So which means you reach faster the base flow when you have them. That's like one of the big changes that we saw. But also, to be honest, I think we left that question open. There is way more research to be done around the topic. For example, one of the big questions that we still have around is where are tiles, right? Like according to some in Iowa, everywhere. According to some others, or for example, DNR, there is a map showing where tiles are, right? But when you show that map to people that has been living there for more than 40 years, they are like, no, this map is not correct. There's tiles here and there that aren't being shown in this map. So I think that's one of the questions, but so far we have seen like there is some changes more regarding the overall volume of water that you get during an event. But for good for us is not affecting the peak flows as much, because we also try to pursue that. And what we did is in a small watershed, we did some storm transposition. So we took like 10,000 storms over the same watershed with and without tiles, and then we compared the peak flows to see if there was like any significant difference, and we didn't see any, or anything that says like, oh, this is like really changing the peak behavior. But I think it's still an open question.
So I guess we'll move on to the second part of our breakout today, which is called Levee Setbacks, a not so simple but worthwhile endeavor. And so our presenters today are Andrea Gebhart, the Community Engagement Manager at JEO Consulting Group. And then we have Dan Fricke, who is a project manager and senior engineer and levee expert in the Water Resources Engineering Department at the JEO Consulting Group. And so again, we'll have 30 minutes for a presentation and then 10 minutes afterwards for audience questions.
Well, hello. Thank you very much for coming to this session. as was introduced. So I'm Dan Fricke. Is there a clicker? Is this the clicker? Success. All right. So yeah, Dan Fricke. I'm an engineer. I do a lot of work with levees and flood risk reduction. And
And I'm Andrea Gebhart. I'm a community planner that specializes in public participation. And in the context of levee conversations, I would be the translator from engineer to general public. So that's my role on this project. And so today we're going to talk about a few things. Here's a quick overview of our presentation. First, we're going to give, a brief history of levees. Then we're going to dive into what are levee setbacks, moving into the disaster management cycle, and then we're going to talk about the importance of pre-disaster planning. So I'll hand it off to Dan to get going on the more engineering side of what we're talking about.
so it's a water conference. I presume you guys probably know what levees are, but didn't want to go just in case. So we have a really simple graphic up here, basically in a really, detailed description, which I won't read, but basically, typically it's an earthen embankment or a levee or a flood wall made out of concrete or metal that keeps water out of certain areas that you don't want it in. Sometimes it's known as the levied area or the excluded area. And so levees in real life. This is, I really appreciate the presentation that preceded us. Actually, some of this presentation we'll talk about that as well. And some of these levees actually are those levees. So the one on the bottom right and the left are actually the Council Bluffs levees, which are not very far from here. And then Des Moines is on the top right. We're engineers, and at least I'm an engineer, and she makes engineers look good. Most of the time when we talk to the public, what they know of levees is that there's a trail. They think it's an embankment that has a trail on top. In fact, it's a levee that happens to serve as a trail host, so to speak. And just to place us, I'm always interested to know where I'm at, and I'm a water nerd, and so I'm always driving around. I'm telling my kids, hey, look at that levee, look at that dam. So we're not actually too far from a levee or a levied system. This is actually a snippet from the core National Levee Database. This is the Missouri River. That's not too far from the Red Star, which is where we're at right now. So we're less than a mile away from the river and what's called the levied area or the levee protected area. And if we zoom out to that National Levee Database from a national scale, all these dots in different colors represent different levee systems across the country. And so some of the stuff we're going to talk about here, I wanted to paint the picture that the context of it is quite large. I mean, we're talking about thousands of individual systems that range from lengths of less than a mile to hundreds of miles. Some of the systems that were in the presentation preceding us on the Missouri River and the Mississippi River have hundreds of miles of particular hydraulic systems. And of interest, we'll talk a little bit about this later too, but there was a lot of activity in the 1900s and before, but certainly in the 1900s and mid-1900s with congressional activity and authorizations for building flood control systems. And you see I've got a graph here that shows, a bar graph that shows the length of levees that were built over time. And you see the big spike there in the 50s to the 70s or 80s, and that's trailed off over time. But, and this information is straight from the National Levee Database, and they've got it pegged at 59 years of average age. I did my own calculation for a different presentation previously, and if you do it by mile, it's actually north of 70 years. And so if you think about these things with respect to what I believe are important pieces of infrastructure that exist, public infrastructure no different than water lines, sewer lines, roads, et cetera, they're really getting up there in age relatively. And they protect very important things, and a lot of it. Again, from the National Levee Database, this is an aggregate. They've identified that over $2 trillion of investment and value exist behind these systems and are at risk should they fail. Significant amounts of population and housing and building stock that exist behind these things. So it's a relatively important thing. So I mentioned congressional activity that really drove a lot of this stuff. Actually, it was oftentimes preceded by some sort of major flooding that occurred. In this area, we were kind of asked to focus on the Missouri River. So the systems along the Missouri River, a lot of that was driven by the Pick-Sloan Plan. And there's kind of some really interesting history if you ever get a chance to read into it. The Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Rec, and actually some other authorities were essentially working in parallel. And the short of it is the Bureau of Rec and the Corps of Engineers plan got combined. The Pick Sloan are two individuals associated with each of those agencies respectively. And it consisted of a few dams on the upstream parts of the watershed, as well as generally levees from Gavin's Point or Sioux City, Iowa, all the way to the mouth of the river at St. Louis. And so yeah, and a lot of that actually got built. And I, again, kind of a history nerd, like to see how things develop. And so one of the most amazing things, I think, at least from an engineering perspective, maybe not so much from the environmental, was how they engineered the river. And so this is a picture, I think, from the 1930s, so pre-river engineering, pre-levees. And just to kind of show how this progressed over time, I've overlaid some what are called bank stabilization and navigation project features. So if you fly above or if you're on the river, you'll see these little rock jetties that come out or revetments that go along the side of a river. And these actually are pretty significant. Sometimes they can tie back over a mile, sometimes into lands. And so that essentially created sedimentation, aggradation, and created a navigation channel 300 feet wide. And then in addition to that, I've got the levee and red line here, and then the purple area is the levied area. And so between the river engineering and then building these levees, there was significant development associated with that Pick Sloan plan and major changes to the river system that occurred along this area. So again, not to bypass anything, but I've been asked before, you know, I live in my engineering world, my friends on the communication side try to make me look big, look good. And so I say setbacks, and people oftentimes think, oh boy, something bad happened or something like that. Well, depends on who you are, but generally speaking, I think levee setbacks are a good thing. And that's essentially where we're basically moving that levee embankment back away from the river. And we'll talk about what that entails, but it essentially amounts to reducing pressure on that overall system of hydraulics and ecosystems. So a few things associated, why would you consider a setback, right? These things have been built, they've been built for a long time, they generally work until they don't. But a few things that drive setbacks could include rehabilitation post-disaster. Some of the examples I'll talk about were driven by that, both from a desire and because they might have been necessary. You guys are probably all familiar with FEMA and the flood insurance program. That drives a lot of decisions, right or wrong, both development decisions and infrastructure decisions. And so what I've worked on a lot of levees associated with are actually people that want their levees to meet certain requirements for FEMA, so they get some benefits associated with that. So that's a decision driver with respect to investment and local sponsorship of levees that we don't want to forget about. Certainly engineering performance, how does this perform, you know, what the loading, what the capacity is, et cetera. And then that is hand in hand with the ecological benefits and that can be associated with in the environment. And then obviously what drove a lot of these decisions from the beginning, still does today, are the economics. Listened to an interesting presentation in one of the breakout sessions prior to lunch about some of the economic analyses that are associated with flood risk reduction infrastructure. And yeah, it was really interesting, but obviously that drove that, and a lot of the federal investment that has occurred over the years typically is associated with what's called a positive benefit cost ratio. So that's where the Corps or whoever has to do an analysis and show that the calculated benefits outweigh the costs by, you know, and the positive BCA is a BCR, a benefit cost ratio of at least 1. So here's some examples of some actual levee setbacks that have occurred here in the area. Again, we're focusing generally on the Missouri here. This is actually down by Hamburg, Iowa. If you followed the news at all in 2011, 2016, 2019, Hamburg is at the bottom end of a large hydraulic levee system that starts really in Council Bluffs, right that way, I think is where it is. And it goes all the way down there. They're kind of at the bottom end. And this particular levee was significantly damaged. I should say on the left-hand side of your screen, I've got highlighted the prior alignment, prior to realignment or setback. And on the right side, I've got the dash line of the original alignment and then the setback alignment. This particular setback was created for a couple reasons. One, there was significant damages When these levees get overtopped or breached, you'll sometimes hear the word breach or a scour hole. Sometimes these holes can be on the order of, almost 100 feet deep. We've actually got some surveyors that did some work post-flood, and they said it was a little tricky being over moving water in this hole that's 100 feet deep. And so sometimes you have the foundation of those levees are so damaged that they can't replace it in the same place. So they actually have to look at it from an engineering performance perspective and move it back. Now, the benefit of this particular one, in addition to creating a lot of, I think this one opened up, I want to say 1,000 or so acres of river floodplain that was otherwise disconnected from the river since they built that levee originally. One of the other benefits, though, is the hydraulic performance of it. So very simply, by moving back that levee a significant distance, you basically opened up and made a bigger pipe for water to flow through. With a bigger pipe, the same discharge actually reduces the water levels. And so we happen to be doing some work in this area and doing some hydraulic modeling. So I asked our engineer to pull a couple profiles of water surface profiles along the river. The blue was actually what the hydraulic profile was. I think it was the 100-year discharge pre-setback. And then the orange is after. And you can see in this area, they see a benefit of up to about 1.5 feet of water surface reduction. And keep in mind, this is 1.5 feet of water surface reduction of about 3,000 to 4,000 feet across the river top. And so it's a really significant benefit. And in this particular area, there's other adjacent levees. So there's levees obviously continuing upstream and downstream of this setback. And there's actually infrastructure on the other side of the river. And so the folks in that region actually see the benefit of these reduced water levels associated with the setback. This is an example that Andrea is going to touch on a little bit more, but this is actually the L536 system, so left bank levee, river mile 536 system down by Corning, Iowa. Also on the river, on the Nebraska side, it's by Indian Cave State Park. They were damaged significantly in the 2011 flood and again in 2019. And there was a group of landowners that really had a desire to see change, and so that's part of what sparked this setback. But you can see a significant setback here. And I think some of the numbers here are similar in the sense that they opened up, I think, over 1,000 acres of floodplain, and I want to say they reduced the water surface elevation of up to 1 foot here. And so you saw some significant benefits associated with some of these setbacks. So although I'm an engineer, I like to consider myself, I know people, or I like people. I like to figure out how they think and why they make decisions and stuff like that. And so one of the things our team is very cognizant of is why people make the decisions they do. And there's this nifty graphic. I couldn't tell you where it's from originally. I've used it so often. It's probably FEMA or something, but we call it the disaster management cycle. And so it highlights this event that occurs over here, flood event, hurricane, tornado, whatever it is. And that creates a litany of domino effect decisions, right? So you have your initial response associated with, rescues, sandbagging, flood fighting, et cetera. And ultimately that event subsides, but then you have the aftermath and you have to recover. It's cleanup, fixing breaches, taking out all those temporary measures you did, fixing the housing stock, rebuilding housing stock and roads, et cetera. And then ultimately as time passes, our hope is that people figure out, boy, there maybe is a better way to do this. And so that kind of transitions into the mitigation side of things. That happened. What can we do different next time? What can we do ahead of that event next time? And then hopefully put that stuff in place and then prepare for the next one. Because in the levee world, unfortunately, there's a saying, and it generally holds true, is there's two kinds of levees in this world. There are those that have failed and those that have not failed yet. And I hate to say that because I designed some levees, but it happens. But one of the big drivers associated with this disaster management cycle and the examples I showed is the Public Law 8499 program. And it's a rehabilitation program that's part of the Corps of Engineers. So when these levees were built originally back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they were authorized by Congress, and the local sponsor was responsible for land rights, some permitting, and borrow material. And then after the Corps built those levees, generally speaking, most levees in the U.S. are actually sponsored by local entities, NRDs, cities, counties, SIDs, that type of stuff. And so the operation and maintenance was turned over to those folks. And the carryover and the continued federal investment in that is represented with this public law, or PL 8499. And that's where they will help you flood fight, and they will also help rehabilitate projects, assuming that the operation and maintenance has been completed in a sufficient manner, like basically hasn't been neglected. This is a great program, and there's a lot of great agencies and people that work for the Corps of Engineers and FEMA, and they are really, really good at responding to disasters, both from a flood fighting perspective as well as a response and recovery perspective, right? And you know, you guys probably all know this, but mobilizing thousands and thousands and millions of people and millions of dollars and billions, frankly, in response and recovery efforts is no small task. But I will say, generally speaking, I think in the U.S. certainly, and probably the world, but we live in this bottom half of the circle. We're kind of addicted to, or we know nothing other than seemingly sometimes response and recovery, and this is a heavy lift. And so once you get done with that, sometimes that momentum and or funding and dollars, et cetera, dies out. And so the mitigation, the preparation, a lot of times falls on local interests. So, you know, if there's a desire to mitigate, sometimes that takes the sponsor to raise their hand and say, we got to do something different next time. And so but the biggest thing to do is with these setbacks, to tie it all together, is those setbacks offer a lot of those benefits that I mentioned. And what that effect has is it basically is, I did my best to show this circle shrinking on the bottom. I got to get some graphic design people to help me out here. But we're shrinking that bottom half of the circle so that our system and our infrastructure is more resilient to flooding, so that when it does happen, because it will, they actually will be able to respond and recover quicker, right? That's one of the key parts of a resiliency definition, is that the ability to recover quickly. And then on the top side of things with mitigation, if we could do what we can proactively, and Andrea's going to talk a little bit about that, that essentially elongates this overall circle, right? From event to other event. Yeah, and it reduces the loading and the risk, et cetera, and lengthens that cycle. I think that's what I want to say there. So looking forward, I don't know how we're doing on time. Doing good? Okay, cool. I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people think of infrastructure and immediately they go to roads, bridges, pipes, sewers, water. I love it. I need that too. However, could you imagine, I mean, for those of you who drove in this morning, I did. I battled traffic on I-80, stop and go. Could you imagine that same amount of people coming in 1950s infrastructure? So the left side of the screen, I've got an aerial showing where we're at right now, and the right side, we've got a current aerial. Obviously, you see some huge differences in transportation infrastructure, but really the same goes for any of the infrastructure we've talked about today. There were some good conversations in the opening session about water and sanitary sewer systems that serve this very area, actually. And so what I find really interesting from a engineering perspective is how levees and dams and some of these water and flood risk reduction infrastructure don't really get the same treatment sometimes. And I think this is it's a good visual for what we see today is a lot of those levees haven't changed. They were built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and generally speaking, they've been mowed. That's kind of the maintenance that's been completed on a lot of these things. Aside from some sponsors that have taken the initiative or they've been damaged in flooding and they want to improve their resiliency to future flooding. And so this is an effort that has been 300 years plus in the making. There's stuff I've read about the French and the Spanish building levees down in New Orleans in the early 1700s. And so you can imagine, I like to think about things in the form of momentum. That's 300 years of momentum associated with this flood risk reduction infrastructure and building levees. And so that's not really going to slow down anytime soon. However, I think with these opportunities for setbacks, they kind of lend themselves to looking forward in that mitigation side, that top half of the circle. And although this isn't the Missouri River, this is a project we're working on out in Idaho. This is an example of a project where, not unlike a lot of water courses in our state and regionally and nationally, back in the 60s, the thought was, let's channelize that thing, let's get this water out here as quickly and efficiently as possible. And some of the benefits associated with those systems were kind of overlooked, right? Connection to the river, ecological benefits and diversity, et cetera. And so this is a project where there's levees on both sides. The community is 100% disconnected from the levee, from the Portneuf River, and the city is taking it upon themselves to basically set back the levee, and for a number of reasons. One, they're creating some ecological diversity over here on the right bank with creating some wetlands and different diverse plantings, et cetera. And on the left side, they're actually looking at a community betterment in the form of amphitheater and some other recreation features that don't really exist. And they're really expecting this to be an economic driver. We're actually going through the process of permitting this with the Corps right now because it's a core structure. So anyway, we're really excited about this, and we really see this as an opportunity. Other potential opportunities like this are going to pop up over time. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Perfect. In talking about disaster mitigation, we're actually going to tell the story post-disaster. And Dan has already mentioned which project we're talking about. This is L536, south of Hamburg, Iowa, technically in Missouri, for those trying to gain context. And this is a result of the 2019 flood that really devastated the area. It was a $100 million post-disaster levee setback. The flooding began and persisted in that March 2019 flood, but it persisted through December, through the winter. So floodwaters were just persistent throughout that whole time. And the construction of this levee setback was substantially complete in July 2021. So note, that's a whole flood season that they went without protection as they rebuilt and reset this levee back. Some of the benefits that Dan started alluding to, I guess in the image, the original levee setback is that green, and the new levee alignment is in the blue. Some of the benefits, 5 miles worth of, I guess that's not a benefit, but it was a 5-mile project that they moved this levee embankment, updated the levee design 5-to-1 landward slide slope, reconnected 1,000 acres of land back to the river or the natural floodplain. It reduced nearly a foot of floodwater surface elevation for the 100-year flood, and it increased the protected area of 20 square miles. And as we get into this, I want to state JEO, Dan and I did not actually work on the design of this. We actually just worked on the documentation of this effort. This was a huge multi-agency coordination that made this possible, and we were just part of the storytellers for their success of this project. So I really would encourage you to go to the Nature Conservancy Missouri chapter's website and learn all about it. They have a great video about how this came to be and talked about the collaboration that went through it. But like I said, our part in this project was documenting the process for them. So following the completion of it, they were still kind of wrapping up construction, still working through real estate issues, and they reached out and said, hey, we went through this incredible process. There is no playbook for other people to do this process again. Can you help us document it? So we produced this document. What's pictured here is actually the digital version of it. There is a printed version. Dan, if you want to hold it up, I did bring it if you want to flip through it. It's a cool resource. And I want to point out that it's a resource primarily for levee sponsors. A lot of times, state, federal agencies are involved in these processes, and they kind of have a playbook figured out. They know the process of what they're doing, but levee sponsors, especially the small, more rural levee sponsors, they don't know what they're doing. They have, a 3-person board that they're just trying to maintain this throughout the process, so they have no idea what they're getting into once they start this project. So this is primarily a resource for levee sponsors, and it's broken into 4 sections. The first being the story, tells the story of the 2019 flood event. The second section is the challenges that they faced and overcome through this project. Third section is recommendations to change processes and procedures that made this a difficult process for the levee sponsors. And then finally, it's a how-to guide. This is the crux of what they wanted to produce. They wanted to document everything they did, but then also give breadcrumbs for other people to pick up this process and do it in their own communities. QR code, link to the playbook, but it will also be at the end. So stay tuned on that one. So how did they do it? Does anybody believe that they followed this linear process in a post-disaster experience? No. Great job, guys. So this is a typical civil works project. Traditionally, you would secure your funding, go through design, do your permitting, acquire your real estate, and then construct. And that typically happens, I would say, maybe over 5 years, maybe over a decade. But in a post-disaster, you really don't have that opportunity to go down this linear process and take 5 years to restore the flood protection. So imagine this, and this is actually what it looked like. This is how the project team described their experience. They were doing everything concurrently all at once. There was no linear process because of the accelerated schedule. So ideally, they wanted to get this done in 1 year because the levee was compromised, which then put people at flood risk. This group decided this was so important to them that they delayed a whole year to get this done right, and we're at more flood risk during that 1 year. So ideally this happens in 1 year, but this actually manifested as a 2-year process of an interwoven approach to it. And in that approach, these were the categories of challenges that they experienced. Levee setback as an alternative, real estate requirements, funding, design, permitting, and construction. Really, those are just the categories, that linear process that they went through, or they could have gone through in a typical civil works project. And I started the 2 real estate requirements and funding because those were the most complex and time-consuming challenges of this effort. I'm going to dive into those in a little more detail, starting with real estate. And in terms of real estate in the L536 example, real estate related to the footprint of the new levee, the footprint of the old levee, the new riverward land, the old riverward land, what do you do with that? And then in this case, they did also have NRCS mitigation acres. So they were dealing with a lot of different types of real estate in this process. And on the right in the yellow, it should be yellow, those are just the pieces that they went through, the obstacles that they had to process and go through to get real estate requirements figured out. And again, like I mentioned when I started, we completed this playbook in August 2021, and they were still working through real estate. Real estate was still an ongoing process just for how complicated it was, and especially once you get federal monies involved and multiple federal agencies, specifically paying the property owners for the real estate became the big crux of the issue. And it resulted in a lot of the landowners being trusting of the process, which if you don't have a good, strong relationship with your public, that also complicates that process. But in this case, they were fortunate to have willing landowners participate in this project. The second piece that was probably the most difficult was funding. And simply, it was just the lack of funding available. And as Dan mentioned earlier, levee sponsors under the PL 8499 law, Public Law 8499, levee sponsors are required for all real estate. So that is the footprint of the new levee and also borrow material. And if you're thinking about real estate and how much that costs and thinking about a levee sponsor, the requirement of that fund is way more than probably what that levee sponsor has sitting in the bank for this project. So they had to get creative in how they were going to come up with this money, tapping into different grant programs, different partnerships, and thankfully the Nature Conservancy came forward and was a huge proponent and sponsor of this project. So real estate cost often exceeds the financial means. And the other piece tying back to the real estate complication was that the setback alternative can't be constructed without the real estate in place. And so an interesting or a creative way they addressed this is they actually bid the construction with an alternate. So they bid it as, we're going to do inline repairs, and in the process, they continued working through those real estate requirements. They were able to secure them, so then they went with the alternate that was the setback. So it enabled them to start construction sooner while still working through that complicated process of real estate. So those were the 2 most challenging ones, but I really want to spend a little bit of time on levee setback as an alternative, because I think we skipped over a big piece of why was the levee setback even an alternative in this situation? And there was an addition to, so in this post-disaster process, we started with that first graphic of create an interagency work group, get into project management, and all these pieces interwoven. When we stepped back, we were like, wait a second, how did we even get here? And this is where there was this decision point of levee setback alternative ? Yes or no? Kind of a decision point of which path are we going to go? And in doing that, the factors of success, the reason that the levee setback was even on the table for an alternative was because of these reasons. Dan mentioned it earlier, the levee district leadership, their willingness to raise their hand and say, hey, we keep having problems with this levee, maybe we should try doing something different. So they had local advocates for their own improvement project. In this case, there was an extended high water conditions. Because the flooding persisted so long, PL 8499 is about getting the levee reconstructed as soon as possible. In this case, you can't start construction in an area that's still flooded, inundated with water. So the extreme event actually bought them the time it needed to bring levee setback alternative into the conversation with the Corps. It also happened to be the least cost, technically feasible alternative. And if you're familiar with PL 8499, to get the funds, you have to construct the least cost, technically feasible alternative, or there is an option to not do that, but then the levee sponsor has to pay for the difference between that. Extended timeline, again, that refers more to the landowners willing to go one whole flood season without flood protection. So that was a big commitment. After 2019, the scale and magnitude of that, could you imagine going into spring 2020 and just hoping and hoping and hoping that that same type of event didn't come down the pipeline? So they were fortunate that that extended timeline didn't hurt them in the end, but that is a huge risk that you're taking on. Interagency communication and collaboration was a recurring theme that came up out of this conversation. It was all about the partners coming to the table and being willing to pursue this initiative together and try something different, and not just the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and like, oh wow, the levee's damaged again. They really focused on trying to create a better situation. And then mentioned earlier, the voluntary landowner participation was critical. And they had done this through, one, it was a small levee board, so they really had good, close working relationships. It was their neighbors that they were working with. And they, even before the project, before the flood happened, they had already started these conversations of what could we do different, which ties into, that's not my slide. That's not my slide. So that's not my slide. We're gonna wing this now. There is another piece to this one where above it, there's actually a flood event happens and you are using a, oh man, I'm gonna have to really figure this out. Oh wait, let me look at it here. So, good thing I brought a printed copy. So in the process, the top one becomes pre-disaster mitigation. And that was the other recurring thing that really came out of this conversation was pre-disaster mitigation. These levee sponsors, again, had already raised their hand and said, stop repairing a levee that's not working. So they had started building those conversations, and dang it, there's a whole few key actions. Give me 1 second. Pre-disaster planning key actions, I flipped right to it. Look at how good I know this levee setback playbook. So in doing that, they've really focused on the concept of, in this situation, they had a whole bunch of willing partners. In other situations, the levee sponsors might not have those existing relationships. And the worst time to build those relationships is after a disaster event. It's way better if we think about that disaster management cycle, if we get it in that mitigation phase. So if you start planning in your mitigation phase of, hey, we seem to be having a lot of recurring issues here on this levee system, what can we do to make it better? So they started pre-disaster mitigation planning without even knowing they were doing it. So they built out a whole key action list, A through I, of what you can do to prepare for it. And I think the couple things that really stood out to me, one, increase collaboration, know your neighbors, know your landowners before you get in. Also find some partners. And I'm gonna give a huge shout out to the Nature Conservancy. They are all about nature-based solutions. So work with your local chapter, start having a conversation with them about what alternatives we could do for flood mitigation. The other important thing that came out, and we couldn't quite solve, but it turned into the recommendation section, is integrate repetitive flood loss data into your local hazard mitigation plans, or just integrate it anywhere. Document it, because no one is actually tracking it in any database. And for you to help justify your cause for a levee setback, you have to show that repetitive losses are happening at the same place, and it merits a discussion around what else can we do. So in doing that and having that conversation, the other thing to work into your local hazard mitigation plan would also be preliminary concepts for what that alignment could be and what the designs would be. If that positions you to make that the least cost, technically feasible alternative, that helps you. The other thing, again, real estate was ongoing throughout even the end of the project, substantially complete. They're still working through real estate projects. And their number one recommendation, aside from tracking repetitive losses, is actually get your land data. Get it figured out, know who your landowners are, build those relationships, and specifically figure out how to get that land data in an accessible, quick, convenient place. Because in this project, they had 3 federal agencies doing land surveying. There could have been redundancy. You could have used the same land survey. One, they were doing 2 different types, meets and bounds, and what's the other version? What? I didn't hear it, but there's 2 different types of surveying. They did both types, and they sent 3 different crews out to get it done. So figure out your land rights beforehand. And then I was going to end on a super powerful quote by Jennifer down in Missouri. Give me a second. Man. Designing. Nope, that's not it. I don't know where it is, but at the end of the day, the only reason this project was so successful was that all these partners came to the table. Missouri came to the table, the Corps came to the table, NRCS was there, the levee sponsor board, the levee board sponsor, or the levee sponsors, board of directors, the property owners were all sitting at that table having that conversation, and they were committed to getting this done. Whenever they hit a snag, they got to a core requirement of, hey, we should really be doing it this way. They were able to rally kind of their troops and say, hey, can we get some leniency in how we're approaching this to make this a better solution for the area? So with that, there is a QR code to the levee setback playbook. We also, when we probably share the slides, there is also going to be a link to a levee setback white paper by Randy Bem. He's been a great resource in the levee setback world. And with that, we will entertain questions. Shout it out. Dan, if we go back 50 years, what should we be doing differently?
That's a good question. What I would probably start with is, I think understanding the value of all the pieces of the puzzle would probably be something big that could have changed, right? I think when a lot of this stuff started, there was real and present danger, potential economic benefits for building these levees where they are, et cetera. And so I think some of that outweighed some of the possibly unknown at the time other benefits associated with maybe giving the river some room to run, the ecological benefits, frankly, the economic benefits associated with that. I think oftentimes we see, and rightfully so, you have landowners behind these levees that are fighting for survival, working the land, making it work and producing for the country and the world. So there's value there, but there's also value associated with that water course and the economic or the ecological benefits that are associated with it. So that's probably where I would start is just maybe having a better holistic picture of the different values associated with that, at least an understanding. And maybe it's a conscious decision. Maybe it still is, you're going to put it right there, but at least maybe you know that going in. The other thing I'd say is it's a magic wand type thing, but we base our engineering based on typically previous data, right? So at the time these were authorized, they were working off of like 70 years worth of data, essentially from the late 1800s to the 1940s. That's when these were authorized, and that's the level of protection that was authorized. And so I know it's a magic wand, but I think they're doing a better job of trying to understand sensitivity associated with different underlying variables, be it hydrologic or hydraulic, and they're trying to better capture the uncertainties associated with these systems and design to those, as opposed to a straight number of 250,000 CFS and this amount of freeboard. So those are a couple things that come to my mind that I think are improvements. And I think the good thing is I think they are doing that stuff now.
Does the new Riverside property, does that generally then go to public ownership, or does that stay under private ownership? How do you make that pitch to that property?
So that one will be completely context dependent. Let me repeat the question. The new riverward side land of a setback levee, who owns that? How do you work through that with the property owner? And in this case, that was a big conversation of what was going on. And one of the real estate pieces of figuring out who does own that, in this situation, they were adjacent to an existing conservation recreational area. And so what they ended up doing, the landowners, I believe, don't absolutely quote me on it, but I believe they had two options. One, they could continue farming. Actually, I do remember it. There was five landowners. Four transferred that property, the new riverward land, into conservation easements maintained by, I believe, the NRCS. The fifth landowner chose to continue farming it, accepting the risk that it might flood, but in the years that it doesn't, that landowner is still going to farm that land and reap the benefits of the agricultural production. But the complicated part of that one is then they had to figure out a way to grant that landowner easy access to riverward side. Because, the purpose of a levee is to essentially block water from going through, but if they're getting access over it, what does that access look like? You can't just cut through the levee because then it just compromises the system. So very context dependent, but this case, the conservation easement really saved the day and provided the funding. It actually, I think NRCS came in and paid for that land versus that landowner who gave the land up and chose to continue harvesting on it. Additional questions? I am going to give a little shout out to John Moore back there because he was a big part of this project. He was one of the primary authors with me. So if you want more about the levee setback playbook, he's a great resource. And I will leave this printed copy for your viewing pleasure. All right, we're out of here.